I'm the Managing Director of the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. We are having our first virtual faculty talk, operating short-term to long-term through the COVID-19 pandemic, negotiating a global renaissance with science diplomacy, with Professor Paul Berkman. Welcome. We are grateful to be able to come together today despite the disruptions in all of our lives as we are dealing with the COVID-19 virus situation. This session is being recorded and may be rebroadcast in the future. Please forgive us if there are any glitches. We're learning to do this as we go. Professor Berkman will discuss common interest building as an essential negotiation strategy. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Professor Berkman, a little bit about our rules for the talk today, and then we'll get started. Professor Berkman is a professor of practice in science diplomacy, and he's the founding director of the Science Diplomacy Center at Tufts University here in Boston, Massachusetts, Medford. He provides training on science diplomacy among university networks, national diplomatic academies, and through the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. Professor Berkman is an internationally renowned scientist, explorer, educator, and author who has made significant contributions to the sustainable development of our world. He began his career wintering in Antarctica on a scuba research expedition. These expeditions ultimately led him to all 7 continents before he turned 30. As a Fulbright Distinguished Scholar at the University of Cambridge, he chaired the Antarctic Treaty Summit at the Smithsonian Institution, and that resulted in the book Science Diplomacy. As head of the Arctic Ocean Geopolitics Program at the University of Cambridge, he co-directed the first formal NATO-Russia dialogue regarding environmental security in the Arctic Ocean. He's the author of several books and book series, and we're very eager to hear from him on these important, relevant issues. Before he begins, I'd like to review just a few Zoom best practices. Please remain muted throughout the session to reduce background noise and be mindful of what's going on behind you, except of course when you want to say something. We invite and encourage you to engage, participate, and enjoy the session. Please use the chat function located at the bottom of the screen if you want to ask a question during the session. There'll be time near the end of the session for Q&A where you can use the raise your hand function, and Professor Berkman will call on you. If your internet speed is slow, you may need to turn off your camera to improve quality. Thank you so much for joining us, and we appreciate your patience as we navigate our first virtual session together. Professor Berkman.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Diane. It's a pleasure and an honor to be able to speak with you remotely. These are difficult times, and my objective today is to try and be helpful. This talk was intended initially to be presented before the COVID virus really took hold, and then was postponed because of everything being postponed. But the strange thing is its relevance has only increased. And I may not be able to say this as concisely and correctly as I want, but certainly my best wishes to the first responders and to the people that are most immediately affected by the COVID virus, not only locally but globally. It's a strange time to be living through a pandemic. And what I'd like to try and do in the opening remarks is, once I can get this, is to look at first principles as best I can in ways that are intended to be helpful. So if we look at the world on a planetary scale, about 30% of the Earth falls within the boundaries of nations, which collectively can be characterized in terms of national interests. After World War II, the world began, our civilization, to identify regions that were explicitly beyond sovereign jurisdictions, the high seas, Antarctica, outer space, the deep sea. And so if we look at the Earth as a whole, this sets up a dichotomy in terms of nation states and national interests versus international spaces and common interests. And the argument that has been developing for decades in terms of my work has been that there's a balance to achieve in terms of national interests and common interests. And so that is the direction of the talk today in terms of operating short-term to long-term through the COVID-19 pandemic, negotiating a global renaissance. For context, I'd like to, I guess, consider the lessons that have preceded. And one of the lessons is from Jules Verne. Wrote a book on the Earth, From the Earth to the Moon in 1865 and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in 1870. And there's great inspiration in those books themselves, in that if we think it, we can build it. And so in a sense, the inspiration is that if we think it, we can build it. And with you, and in ways that are intended to be a matter of building common interests, I have optimism and hope that we can build a global renaissance, recognizing that we have a very significant period ahead of us, which will be filled with gloom and doom and sorrow and things destroyed and so on. My hope is to look through this in ways that build for the future, recognizing that these are issues that operate across time. So let's see, the next slide. In that sense, the discussion is about building a global renaissance with science diplomacy. And I first find it important to define terms. So one term is science. And I'd like to suggest an alternative to the definition, to the framing of science, that science is the study of change. In a sense, natural sciences, social sciences, indigenous knowledge, all characterize patterns, trends, and processes that become the bases for decisions, albeit with different methods. And so really the essence is to use the understanding of patterns, trends, and processes to make decisions. And it is the decision-making process that really is the heart of today's discussion. There's a lesson where I started my journey, as Susan mentioned. I spent a year in Antarctica scuba diving under the ice when I was 22, literally walking off the earth for a year to look at the world we live in from a distance. And for somebody that was 22 and still, it was a profound experience to be scuba diving under the ice throughout the year, temperatures down to 115 below zero, no formal supermarkets or post offices or any of the familiarities we have. But the Antarctic itself revealed some important lessons. And the Antarctic Treaty that was signed in 1959 raised a question in my mind when I was 22, that was in 1982, and I've been asking the same questions consistently since. Why did the United States and the Soviet Union cooperate continuously in Antarctica throughout the Cold War, despite the animosities that isolated them everywhere else, except for outer space? And so it's instructive to look at the Antarctic Treaty in terms of lessons, and those lessons become particularly relevant to the world today. The Antarctic Treaty is remarkable in that it is the first nuclear arms agreement. It was designed in the interest of all mankind forever. The word forever is in the preamble of the Antarctic Treaty. It was based on scientific investigation. It was for peaceful purposes only. The area of 60 degrees south latitude accounts for about 7% of the Earth's surface. And the basis for the Antarctic Treaty and its operation was consulting and recommending measures of common interest. And the observation is that the journey, the starting point for the journey determines what the journey looks like. So if you start from a position of conflict, the journey is filled with conflict. And if you start from a position of common interests, the journey is filled with cooperation. And in the case of the United States and the Soviet Union, at the height of the Cold War in 1959, their journey originated based on common interests. And those common interests carried them throughout the Cold War in terms of productive dialogue. And it is those lessons that I'd like to try and bring forward to the current circumstances with the COVID-19 pandemic. Out of that emerged the context, there were many parallel discussions ongoing at the same time, but out of that emerged the definition of science diplomacy. I chaired the Antarctic Treaty Summit in Washington, D.C. in 2009 on the 50th anniversary of the Antarctic Treaty. People like Ban Ki-moon gave keynotes and so on. And out of that came a description of what science diplomacy is as an international, interdisciplinary, and inclusive process involving informed decision-making to balance national interests and common interests for the benefit of all on Earth across generations. And it's interesting in the current circumstances to even read the words that were written in 2009 about balancing national interests and common interests for the benefit of all on Earth across generations. And this is the challenge that we currently face, literally, is for the benefit of all on Earth across generations. In this sense, science diplomacy is a language of hope. It is being developed, it is being applied, it is being refined, and it is something that all of us are part of in the sense of backgrounds, whether it's natural science or social science or indigenous knowledge. And so one of the observations about science diplomacy is that the challenge is to operate across time. It's not just the moment. So in a sense, this was a diagram, a figure that came out of a meeting I convened in 2016 with the Foreign Ministers Science and Technology Advisory Network. And these were advisors to foreign ministers looking at the advice that they would give to the foreign ministers. And out of that came the observation that the types of advice would operate across a continuum. At one end of the spectrum would be security timescales, issues dealing with that were immediate to mitigate risks of political, economic, societal, environmental instabilities. On the other end of the spectrum were sustainability timescales, challenges of balancing societal, economic, and environmental considerations across generations. And it wasn't one end or the other, it was a continuum, and that both were necessary. And so out of that figure, that notion of a continuum of urgencies, came a definition of what an informed decision is, that an informed decision operates across a continuum of urgencies. The advantages of having a definition of an informed decision means that we can also characterize when decisions are uninformed. For example, if it's only considering the future without any real touch to the present, that's not informed. Or if we're looking at the present only without consideration of the future, that's not informed either. So to make an informed decision operates across a continuum of urgencies, from short-term to long-term. In the context of negotiation, at the security timescale, where there are immediacies that are well ingrained, in a sense, there's a process of adjusting to the different agendas and perspectives and sense strategies of conflict resolution. At a sustainability timescale, the challenge and the opportunity is to think in terms of common interest building. Now, recognize this presentation and these concepts were construed well before there was a global pandemic. And the context of common interest building today is clearly more relevant than it was even a couple of weeks ago. The methodology of informed decision-making. So an informed decision, in a sense, is the apex goal. It's not a right decision, a wrong decision, a good decision, or bad decision. It's an informed decision, a decision that optimizes the various information resources, the various perspectives, and makes a decision. The process starts with questions. I'm an old fan of the Socratic method, so that's convenient, but the questions are the lowest hanging fruit in terms of building common interests before agendas are expressed. when there are questions of common concern, it reveals the methods and the data that would answer those questions. In the context of data and questions, those are phases of research where people are observing change. Data, however, is not evidence. Evidence involves the institutions that make decisions. And so evidence is for a decision. However, the evidence itself is incomplete in terms of the decision making. The options are important. And in the case of science diplomacy, the diplomacy part is that comes from options without advocacy, which can be used or ignored explicitly. So in this talk, for example, I have great respect for the audience. I respect each of you as a decision maker in the various institutions and professions and positions that you hold in the world. It would be presumptuous of me to recommend anything to you. So in the spirit of diplomacy, anything that I say now is to be considered an option without advocacy, respecting you, and these options can be used or ignored explicitly. In terms of change, which is the essence of this talk, talking about short-term to long-term, at the security timescale today with the COVID-19 virus, we are experiencing as a world at local to global scales exponential change. This is change where the number of infections today is greater than the number of infections yesterday. The number of infections tomorrow will be greater than the number of infections today. And in a sense, that provides a rate of change. When the rate of change is greater than 1 consistently over time, it leads to an exponential growth. At some point in the future, the system will be saturated with the virus, adjusted in terms of mortality, displacement, whatever comes along, good fortune with vaccines. But at some point, there'll be an inflection where the rate of change, the number of infections today equals the number of infections yesterday. And the number of infections tomorrow equals those today. At some point, the number of infections will begin to reduce. And that point is a part of a curve called logistic part of the curve. And that's when we approach sustainable solutions. So I put this up there because in a sense, the decision making is across this spectrum from security to sustainability timescales, traversing exponential change to logistic change and understanding how to operate across a continuum of urgencies. So one continuum of urgencies and exponential change that was well introduced just a few months ago or years ago that has been on the radar of the world, but a challenge to effectively consider is the exponential change with human population growth. So in the year 1800, there were 1 billion people on Earth. In 1920, just after World War II or World War I, there were 2 billion people. At the end, during this decade, there will be 8 billion people on Earth. We went from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 in 200 years. And this is an example of exponential growth. Another example of exponential growth, and these two lines were drawn independently, measured independently. They just happen to match each other. The orange line is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we can see that it is also exponentially increasing over time. It's been referred to as the hockey stick, perhaps disparagingly, but the context is that we have two examples of exponential growth. And the time frame, the challenge is not to look just from one of the yellow dots. The time frame is to consider circumstances that happened before and will happen after, to place the moment in context so that we can make informed decisions. This is the COVID-19 current circumstance. So the picture on the top is a snapshot of the virus on Earth as of yesterday from the Center for Systems Science and Engineering at Johns Hopkins University. Yesterday at 9:46 in the morning, there were 438,000 cases of the COVID virus around the world. China was where the virus started, 81,000 cases in China, 69,000 cases in Italy, 55,000 cases in the United States yesterday. As of yesterday, there were 19,000 people that had died due to the COVID virus. So what I did was I looked at the virus distribution on the 1st of March at a global level, and I took the top 3 countries in terms of numbers today: China, Italy, and the United States. So if we look at the world global distribution of COVID-19, its rate of increase is about 1.07 infections per day, consistently from March 1st through today. That means that in 35 days, there will be a multiple of 10. And if it was the same rate, that means it will multiply another times 10. So that means in 35 days, there'll be 4 million cases. In another month, there'll be 40 million cases. In another month, there'll be 400 million cases. In another month, there would be 4 billion cases in terms of human population, if it decreased at the same rate as today. China took relatively severe measures to control the virus, and they approached what looks like a logistic curve, isolating parts of China, recognizing cities like Beijing and Shanghai were not yet affected. So it is anticipated that there will be a next wave of infection in China, but China is banking on the idea that they will be able to prepare for it, the idea of flattening the curve that's been in the media recently. If we look at Italy, Italy's been increasing at a rate of about 1.16 per day infections since March 1st. And that means that Italy will increase its severity of infections about every 16 days. In the United States, the rate is at about 1.3 infections per day, which means that the United States is going to go through an order of magnitude change about every 10 days. On March 1st, just for background, on March 1st in the United States, there were 98 cases of the COVID-19 virus. And as of yesterday in this figure, there were 55,000 cases. So it went from 98 to 55 within a matter of 3 weeks. The number today, when I last looked, is 69,000 in the United States. So these figures are real figures in terms of that we can see at a direct timescale of acceleration of an exponential change. And it is that type of change that is important to consider in terms of thinking short-term to long-term. The types of decisions that are involved certainly involve governance mechanisms, laws, agreements, policies, regulatory strategies at diverse jurisdictional levels, from local, state, national, international, but also decisions that will involve built infrastructure, infrastructure that is fixed or mobile, other types of assets, but the characteristics of built infrastructure requiring technology plus investment. And I would note that to achieve sustainable solutions, that the challenge is to couple the governance mechanisms and the built infrastructure. In a sense, the world has been given a gift with the Sustainable Development Goals. The reason it's a gift is they are international, they are interdisciplinary, and they are inclusive. They operate at local to global scales. And so in a sense, the questions that can be asked to work from questions to data to evidence to options cross all of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They cross all jurisdictions. They operate on a planetary scale. And this is the essence of the talk. It is built with hope and inspiration that as severe and as difficult and as terrible as the COVID virus is on Earth, my hope as an individual on Earth is that we learn from this and plan for the other side. And so in that sense, my hope is that what we do as a civilization together through networks, through discussions, through internet dialogues like this one, where we are lucky compared to the Spanish flu of last century where they had no digital. Today we can communicate remotely, we can observe remotely, we can analyze remotely, and we can build remotely. And so my hope to work with you and others is to awaken a renaissance with lifelong learning that happens on the other side as we rebuild from this COVID-19 virus. It remains to be seen how severe it will be. My hope is that it is not as severe as projected by those exponential curves that I just showed you. So my hope is that not only will we continue education with reading and research and training with arithmetic and writing, but leadership itself will involve informed decision making, and that in a sense we create a world where there is lifelong learning with reading, writing, and arithmetic and informed decision making, starting at the scales of K through 12 in terms of education, learning research skills at universities, and developing leadership skills as we move into our professions. And so it is with hope and inspiration. Hope is a garden, and so I am planting seeds, thinking of the future generations. I thank the Program on Negotiation for the opportunity to share this with you. And open this to questions, certainly. Christine Bartle, yes, please. You may have to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes. Hello?
I'm still here. I'm not sure who else is still here. It's Christina.
Hi, Christina.
Now we can hear you.
Okay, that works.
Hi, Christina.
Hello.
Go ahead.
I saw somebody's hand. Are there questions?
There's a question from Christine Bartle. She asks, can you please talk about the impact to the climate at this time?
Impact to the climate in terms of the COVID-19 virus? Well, one observation is that we have an unintended experiment. Basically, much of the transportation systems that would have been operating and producing greenhouse gases are diminished during this period. So there are presumed, I don't know what they are, but presumed impacts on local and other ecosystems, systems of various flavors that would be related to climate. I would say there's a larger opportunity in that the challenge with climate is that it operates on a planetary scale. And so if we're talking about climate, in effect, the reason we're talking about climate is because there's a lot of us on Earth. And so the two exponential curves that I showed with climate change and human population growth are coupled in ways that are being determined. But to think about the current circumstances, there is a tide change in a sense that the world is now keenly aware of importance of common interest building as opposed to self-interest. And as the circumstances become deeper, presumably that sense of common interest building will increase. My hope is that we will carry that sentiment with us and use that as guidance when we deal with issues on a planetary scale, including climate and human population growth. Christine Johnson.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so very much for this. And it is quite a synchronicity for me because our organization is about to launch in the UN doing the number 16. And the Secretary General from the UN has called for a complete coming together of the communications. And I so respect what you're doing. And what I'm wondering right now is, in your estimation and your experience, where, given all the initiatives that are happening worldwide now to bring us together and the countries, where do you see the most hotspot of common interest building? And on what levels? Going back to your paragraph, your pyramid, starting with the questions, because the questions, as Paul Donahue calls beautiful questions, are vital to raise up the pyramid. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your important question. I would note that data is a rallying point right now. I work with the International Science Council and the Committee on Data, and have been involved with a number of discussions recently where there are questions for OECD and other organizations, World Meteorological Organization, Health Organization, that are opening the doors to sharing data. Journals are making available all of the articles dealing with COVID-19 freely available rather than trying to charge for them. So I'd say one area that nations and institutions are rallying around in terms of common interest building rather than exacting profit is around data. And I think that is really an important moment in the sense of capacity building, that while we're all sequestered in our various safe spots, the opportunity still exists for us to be productive, to communicate with each other, to look at the various forms of information, to interpret them, to share interpretations, and to build. And I think it is in the building, while we're sequestered, while the world is effectively slowed down, where we have the greatest opportunity to plan thoughtfully for the future.
Hi, Paul. I'll read a question that was sent in through chat from Rosalie Anders.
Okay.
How can we more effectively move a cooperative agenda forward nationally and internationally?
There are, my sense is that, just based on personal experience, that it's normally very difficult to talk in terms of common interest building. There's the inertia in the system is more at the conflict resolution timescale. Under current circumstances, nations are cooperating and working together, some more than others. And I think the opportunity is to emphasize the moment and learn from it and figure out how to sustain it beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, if the numbers are correct that I showed you, and just looking at the you know, just dispassionately at the numbers, it'll take something on the order of 4 or 5 months to go through the entire world in terms of infection. What that means in terms of disruptions and changes to economies, to lifestyles, to professions is unknown. But the hope is, my hope is that during this period we can think across short-term to long-term and to anticipate the types of solutions in the world that will come after the COVID-19 virus. I mean, this is something that touches all of us. None of us are immune, and this is the challenge. I mean, we all feel this at a personal level, and you know, it is a matter of people, each of us working together, like institutions and like nations, to think on a planetary scale. And it is my hope that this is done with a sense of time, that it's not just the immediacies that are important, it's also thinking across generations. You make the observation that the children that are born today, even the young adults that are around us, some of them will be alive in the 22nd century. And so thinking across a political timescale is inadequate to effectively manage the activities of humankind at a planetary scale. And so this is the challenge we face. And if there's a blessing in disguise, it is that the world has a moment, a breather, to look at itself and to reflect and to think forward in ways that will create capacity for future generations.
Thank you. So we have a question in from Bruce Hecht.
Okay. Hi, Bruce.
Hi, this is Bruce. So I was wondering if you could say more, thank you for this, about this idea as you described it, the Renaissance. Can you paint maybe a picture of what that might look like, both, I guess, in terms of time scales, right? So maybe some short term, but what does it look like? How can we help that emerge?
So again, the concept of a Renaissance is a bit far-fetched. I mean, we're working through a very difficult period, and to some it maybe seem as preposterous to even think in terms of a Renaissance. But my vision of this, like a Renaissance, is it's related to education at the heart of it. And so the question is, what does the education look like? Well, I think in the world that we live in, that reading, writing, and arithmetic are certainly necessary, but I don't think they're sufficient. They're not sufficient with all of the information that's available instantaneously and effectively, infinitely with the internet, social media, cell phones, and so on. And so the challenge is to give people the skill set to operate with all of this information, to make informed decisions that operate across a continuum of urgencies. I think this training begins in elementary school. I think the skill sets of learning how to build common interests is something that can be trained and reinforced and be a part of lifelong learning from elementary and K through 12 through universities and into professions. One of the things I'm involved with is training diplomatic academies, and they would make the observation that the diplomats that come into the academies are, let's say, 25 years old, and they're going to be there till the age of 65. And so the governments are saying, well, we've got a person that we're bringing in who's going to be involved for 40 years. What can we train them that will be relevant 40 years from now under circumstances that we can't imagine? And I would argue that the real capacity isn't a specific skill set. It's a generalized skill set to work in the face of change, to think short-term to long-term. So in terms of what a Renaissance would look like, I would imagine that it will take 1 or 2 generations to go through K through 12 and universities and have those children that become the decision makers of the future in the positions of influence in the various institutions where the decisions are being made. My hope is that in the future, when we position the leaders of institutions, whatever they may be, that they are the most gifted, informed decision makers, the ones that have the capacity to operate best in terms of the distillation of information and to think in ways that create balance among the different types of perspectives inclusively, different stakeholders. So that would be my hope as what a Renaissance would look like.
Okay, next we have a question from Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld. Joel?
Hello, Joel.
Hey, greetings. So I think all of us on this call probably share your hope for the new patterns that we're seeing in response to COVID-19 having an enduring legacy that is more collaborative. If we go back to Kurt Lewin, he argued that you achieve change not by pushing harder on the drivers, but by lowering the barriers. And like you, I've been involved in some of the open sharing of data in science. And what we trip across as barriers are these deeply embedded assumptions that data is proprietary, that business models for journals can't change, and so on. As you look 6 months to a year out, assuming that either we go through the waves of progressions or that there is a treatment that is effective, instead of a snapback to how things were, what would you highlight as some of the most important, deeply embedded assumptions in the system that we should be working on so that, in fact, this can be a pivotal event that leverages change? In other words, beyond the hopeful things that we'd like to reinforce, what are some of the embedded assumptions in the system that need attention in order to see that happen?
Thank you for your question. One observation is the notion of allies and adversaries. And some of these are deeply ingrained. At the time when everybody shares common interests, it's a matter of survival. Issues of allies and adversaries tends to be minimized. I go back to the Antarctic experience. At the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union came together to create the Antarctic Treaty. President Eisenhower invited nearly 70 secret meetings in the United States with the Russians during the height of the Cold War, the McCarthy era and so on, to think about the Antarctic Treaty in terms of survival of all on Earth. At the time, we didn't have ballistic missiles, and there was common interest building and the notion of forever. And they built a process. And the process was one of continued consultation on matters of common interest. It wasn't a matter of designing a process that was based on the individual interests of the various parties. It was a process to continuously elaborate and build and actuate common interests. And I see that as the underpinning of how we go forward. Is it a matter of identifying a strategy, a process? And I've characterized that it's international, it's interdisciplinary, and by far the biggest challenge is to be inclusive. So the systems, the inertia that you speak of, tends toward self-interest. And that is part of where the difficulties lie in the world. There are lots of self-interests, and those are falling by the wayside at the moment. In the figure that I showed, it went from an exponential change to an inflection point, and it went then to a logistic change. And so the observation is, and it's intuition as much as anything, is that while we're in the exponential change, there will be less of a threshold to think in terms of common interest building. Once we get to that inflection point, and the pressure of the difficulties we're currently experiencing begin to be minimized, the tendency will be back to go business as usual. And so there is a window of opportunity that we have, I think, during this difficult period ahead of us, to think in ways of common interest building that enable that as an approach to take root and to grow strong for the future. Otherwise, I would say that you're correct, Joel, that the tendency of the system will be to go back to self-interests. Historically, just as an observation, after World War II, the world was brought to its knees with the horror and destruction of violence on a planetary scale. It wasn't regional, it wasn't continental, it was world war. And for the next 2 decades after World War II, it was possible for the international community to think in terms of common interests. And that was the reason the high seas was designated as the first international space beyond sovereign jurisdictions. Antarctica next in 1959, outer space in 67, and the deep sea in 1971. In effect, the world recognized that it was in their collective interest to create international spaces where nations wouldn't fight over boundary issues, and designating 70% of the Earth in terms of common interests. And I would say that as an observation, somewhere in the early 1970s, mid-1970s, the world began to progressively dissemble into nationalism, to the point where we were just a couple weeks ago even. And the lesson of the 20th century, in a sense, is that nationalism breeds global conflict. And so, you know, in that context, this virus, as difficult and as terrifying and as damaging as it is, may be a blessing in disguise, because we're living through a period of common interest building, issues of survival in the absence of global conflict. So I don't know whether I answered your question, Joel, but it is an important question to continue to ask and to think about in terms of how we create capacity with common interest building going forward beyond the COVID-19 pandemic.
If I could, just to follow up on that, because I really appreciate your comment. What it got me thinking was, in the 1990s, many companies shifted a basic assumption about competition, in which prior to that, strategic alliances and joint ventures were viewed as risky because you might give away intellectual property. And then almost collectively it shifted to, if you weren't involved in joint ventures and collaborative enterprises, you might miss out on new ideas. So their self-interest was still going on, but they saw it in their self-interest to be part of something more collaborative. And so I wonder if there's, you know, to hope for everyone to suddenly say, let's create pre-competitive or non-competitive spaces, such as you described, around global health, that might happen to some degree, more than is now. But some of the rest is at risk of snapback. And so in a sense, I'm wondering whether there's a way, in kind of a skilled mediator transformational sense, of taking some of those competitive dynamics and reinterpreting them so that they still are lifted up, but as part of a collaborative enterprise.
It is hard to say how far down the foundation will be taken, and how disrupted the institutions in the world will be, how much collective assistance will be needed on a planetary scale, what the risks will be after the virus is ended. You know, we're just, if the curve is correct, we have 450,000 cases, 500,000 cases on Earth, and we've got 8 billion people. There's still most of the virus impact is in front of us. And so I think it is a matter of being attuned and thinking in ways that are hopeful, but recognizing that we don't know what the build will be after this is all said and done. Certainly, for nations to think in an isolated manner would seem intuitively to be unproductive in a world where economies are completely undermined by the current circumstances. So I could see institutions learning and growing in collaborative manners, building in ways that are different and hopeful, and using lessons like the ones you identified for the future.
Okay, we have a question from Nandini Garg.
Hi, Nandini.
Is she there?
Yeah. Hello, Paul. So my question is, there are high expectations that the global initiatives will achieve through science diplomacy goals, and development seems to be beyond the immediate technical objectives, which can be thwarted by the planning, designing, implementation, and management of international relations. So my question is, how are we going to negotiate on global health diplomacy front, knowing that at present it requires a delicate combination of technical knowledge, legal expertise, diplomatic skill set, which needs to be systematically cultivated among either the foreign services or global health professionals. Else, there can be a worldwide breakdown in economic, social, and political terms largely.
So you've asked a very difficult question. I'm not sure that I'm able to answer it completely or fully or even correctly. One observation is that governments around the world are recognizing that science and technology advice is important in terms of decision making. There are networks of science and technology advice. The Foreign Ministry Science and Technology Advice Network, the International Network for Government Science Advice, European Science Advisors Forum, for example. These in a sense, the challenge there is you have individuals that are advising individuals, but the advice cascades through academies and to individual faculties and individual faculty members. And the real challenge there is how do we contribute those insights together? And I don't know the answers to that. I, in a sense, am planting seeds or intending to plant seeds in this discussion that the solutions that you're asking about require communities that work together, that build together. And I would note the opportunity we currently have is we're basically sequestered into our safe spaces and can think together, and we can produce together in ways that would not have been possible while we're running around the world to various meetings on a regular basis. So there is time that we didn't have before that is available to begin to ask these questions. And I think these are important questions. I think all the questions are important. And to create the capacities where we identify questions of common concern. And the questions of common concern will reveal methods to answer those questions. And in a sense, the process of questions of common concern cascading to data, to evidence, to options, to informed decisions, perhaps there are efficiencies, economic efficiencies, new economies that will emerge by these processes. It's, for example, been interpreted that there is something called a knowledge economy. How does it really operate? I mean, if somebody in Africa has a need and somebody in North America can solve it, how do we create the solution? We can all operate digitally, for example. What does that capacity look like in terms of going forward, this diplomacy? So you've asked a good question. I'm not sure I answered it correctly, so please ask it again.
Oh, I have a question, Professor Berkman.
Please, Paul.
Paul, so you've talked about outer space and Antarctica. I'm curious to know what you think about the current situation in the far north Arctic, where because of the melting ice pack, ships are now able to go back and forth east to west. China cares about that, Russia, Canada, the US, other northern countries. And there are a lot of moves being made that are very territorial, but there may still be time to do some common interest building. Do you see that happening at all?
So the Arctic learned the lessons from Antarctica. One of the people that I worked with was named Vladimir Golitsyn, who was the president of the Law of the Sea Tribunal. And he had been an attaché for Mikhail Gorbachev and had approached the State Department in the 1980s with the question of taking the lessons from Antarctica and bringing them to the Arctic. And so Gorbachev, in a famous speech in 1987, talked about an Arctic Research Council. He gave the vision of the North Pole as a pole of peace. And the Antarctic lesson was using science as a tool of diplomacy. And so out of that, in 1996 came the Arctic Council. And the Arctic Council is based on scientific cooperation with its different 6 working groups. Even during the period that we're currently facing with geopolitics, even during that period, the United States and Russia served as the task force leaders starting in 2011 to produce binding agreements. First was a search and rescue agreement in 2011. Next was a pollution preparedness and response agreement in 2013. And during the Trump administration, an Antarctic science agreement, the agreement on enhancing international Arctic scientific cooperation emerged. There's a polar code, and there was recently an agreement on fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean and the high seas beyond sovereign jurisdictions. And so the observation is that at a diplomatic level, the nations are cooperating. They are building binding agreements. They are working together. The difficulty is that Others who are not involved in the negotiations are looking at pieces of information and interpreting them in directions of militarization, for example. There is a reality check for this. The circumstances of the Arctic Ocean are of extreme strategic importance and have been since the early 1960s. The things that are underwater are far more strategic than the things above the water, boots on the ground or planes overhead. And so to the extent that the pathway that was set by Mikhail Gorbachev, my observation is that it is viewed with a high degree of receptiveness in Russia. That even though Mikhail Gorbachev as an individual is persona non grata effectively, his concepts that were emerged from the Murmansk agreement or speech in 1987 have become part of the institutional framework that Russia has. And the observation is that Russia is 50% of the Arctic is Russia. Any issues in the Arctic are incomplete without Russia's engagement. The challenge is that Russia is the only coastal state that's not a member of NATO, for example. And so my personal experience is that Russia has been very engaged in thinking about science diplomacy at a very high level in the government. I recently produced a baseline of Russian Arctic laws that goes back to the beginning of the 19th century. That was a project that was done in collaboration with former foreign minister of Russia. And what it demonstrates more than anything else is an interest to be transparent. Good, bad, or indifferent, whatever the circumstances are with Ukraine and Crimea and everything else. In the Arctic, I think the real issue there is for Russia, which is the majority stakeholder player in the Arctic, and certainly in terms of shipping. And I've been working with satellite record ship, produced the longest satellite record of ship traffic in the Arctic Ocean, going back to 2009. And it's clear Russia has the largest presence in terms of ship traffic in the Arctic. And for Russia, their economic future is in the Arctic. And I've been in a number of meetings, not face-to-face, but in the same room with Vladimir Putin since 2010. And each of those meetings, it was expressed that for the economic future of Russia is in the Arctic. And so in a strange way, I actually think the economics of the Arctic is its greatest stabilizing feature, because it would be counterproductive for Russia in specific to destabilize the Arctic. So in the context of your question, you brought in China as well. And China is aside from the political rhetoric that goes back and forth, I think China has done something remarkable in the sense of a vision of global infrastructure development across the 21st century. People can question motives and strategies and all of that, but the notion of us living in a globally interconnected civilization and the notion of infrastructure development across the 21st century, there's no other country on earth that has taken that time horizon in play. And in the case of the Arctic, it's real. They talk about a polar Silk Road as being part of their One Belt, One Road initiative. The Costco has a significant holding in the Yamal Peninsula in terms of the ships that are going out of the liquid natural gas containers. And Russia has significant shareholding in the ports in Europe. And so effectively, they've built the end members from Asia through the Arctic in terms of shipping and the ports in Asia and Europe to think about a polar Silk Road. So, in a basic sense, an observation, historic observation, is that anytime a nation or set of nations or whatever group changes a trade route, it changes the dynamics of nations. And so if there is a polar Silk Road that goes through the Arctic, it will change the dynamics of nations on Earth.
Thank you, Paul.
We're reaching the end of our, oh, maybe one last question, but make it quick. Go ahead.
Yep. So there's one more question here from Henry Lieberman.
Okay. Hello, Henry.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so about Antarctica, I was wondering about the Space Force that Trump announced. Doesn't that contradict the treaties that say that space is going to be forever the common heritage of mankind, peaceful and all that?
It does. The simple answer is yes, it does. And the circumstances that led to the Antarctic Treaty were started with outer space. There was a meeting in 1955 called Open Skies Agreement, and it was a meeting between Eisenhower and Bulganin from Russia, and they wanted mutual verification, reconnaissance of the development of their ballistic missile facilities. And that didn't work. And the first agreement that came out, the very first space policy of the United States was the United States was going to launch a satellite, a scientific satellite during the International Geophysical Year. And so the issues of outer space were fundamental, but they weren't possible in the 1950s to negotiate directly. And so the Antarctic became a surrogate for outer space. And I went through the National Security Council minutes of the 1950s, which have been declassified. And if you look at the term Antarctica in the National Security Council minutes, they come up consistently with defense strategy, nuclear weapons, etc. And the issues that were not possible to address in the outer space initially were addressed in the Antarctic Treaty, which is the reason that became the first nuclear arms agreement. And it served as a template for the Outer Space Agreement in 1967, which had the same sense of survival involved, in the sense that if you had nuclear weapons pointing down at the Earth, the way that we would live our lives, each one of us would be different. And the security that we would have on Earth would be different. And so the questions that came out of that, the first time the Sputnik went around the Earth, even though the United States understood that was going to happen, the Eisenhower had told the von Braun, under no circumstances was he going to launch a rocket into orbit, and before the International Geophysical Year. Sputnik was the first one. A few months later, the United States launched their satellite. And the reason that there was a sense of delay, in part, was because the first time Sputnik went around the world, the United States was able to say, look, space is open and free. It's peaceful. And that had been the intention from the 1950s forward, that outer space would continue to be open and free and peaceful. And I think that discussions about militarizing outer space, in a sense, are not thinking short-term to long-term, because long-term in the context of outer space is centuries. And the journey that we have as a civilization at this point is positioned to think across centuries. And I think that's where my hope is in terms of a renaissance, is that we have an opportunity to build a civilization that's hopeful and peaceful on a planetary scale.
Okay, thank you. And just more generally, when you have a situation where there's, these implacable adversaries like the US and the Soviet Union, when I think about Antarctica, sometimes I think that what happened is basically, they just, the politicians just figured, look, Antarctica, it's cold, you can't live there, there's no resources. Let the scientists have their little playground. It's a shithole country, and so maybe that speaks to a possible strategy for achieving cooperation, which is just, you convince the politicians that it doesn't matter, it's worthless, right? And then they let the scientists talk to each other, and the scientists are cooperative rather than adversarial.
Well, there are two elements to your question. One is that the Antarctic, because it was uninhabited, the alternative was also possible. It could have been a testing ground for weapons or storage ground for weapons, yet United States and the Soviet Union decided not to test weapons and store weapons in Antarctica. So the challenge, in a sense, is to learn from that period, the dialogues, the sense of common interest that enabled these adversaries to cooperate. And they cooperated continuously throughout the Cold War in Antarctica, despite their geopolitics that isolated them everywhere else.
But it wasn't the same groups of people. The politicians had washed their hands of Antarctica, and most of the cooperation was between the scientists. Isn't that correct?
Well, that was part of the origin of thinking about science diplomacy. So, you know, there's all flavors of diplomacy, like there's all flavors of security. But science itself crosses boundaries, all kinds of boundaries, time and space boundaries, sense of change, but it also, in a sense, is a common language among allies and adversaries alike. You know, even during the Cold War, people like Sakharov were working with great respect in the West. So, in a sense, the science part of it is a tool of diplomacy. And the argument is that each of us, in our positions, whatever we are, whatever we do, have opportunity to serve, in a sense, as science diplomats, bringing together allies and adversaries alike. And I would just note, as a personal case study, when I was at the University of Cambridge with a colleague at MGIMO University in Moscow, so two professors, no real political chops. We weren't in charge of any big institutions. There was no political position that we had of any capacity. But the two of us convened the first formal dialogue between NATO and Russia regarding security in the Arctic. And that specific dialogue had to go through the entire NATO-Russia Council, 27 members of NATO, plus Russia at the level of ambassadors, just to approve that dialogue. And so that means that if an individual like me, without any real position, can pull together allies and adversaries, that sense of capacity exists with all of us. And for me, the journey has been one to self-diagnose, in that sense, to extract those lessons and to train them and give those capacities to others.
On behalf of the program on negotiation, I want to thank you so much for this truly inspirational and informative talk. It was really wonderful. We will be posting this at some point on our website, and if anyone had further questions, they could email you at Tufts University.
Welcome to. It would be an honor and a pleasure to continue the discussion.
Thank you so
very much,
much,
Susan. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.